Ever heard of a bloke called Terry Godsil? Chances are you haven't, but don't worry, because you are not alone. Now, Godsil was instrumental in bringing Pontiac to the SCCA Trans-Am series, and as a result, in the Pontiac Firebird Trans-Am being created. Now, most people associate the Pontiac Trans-Am with Burt Reynolds and the Hoff. It became a star of the big screen and in TV land, but that was never its original intention. It was created for one purpose only, and that was to go racing. Anyway, back to Godsil. He was a Canadian businessman who had a love for racing. His father owned a company that supplied components to General Motors, and therefore Terry was pretty well connected. And obviously he had strong GM connections, and he used those connections in racing. And he was also a big supporter of the hugely talented Canadian racer Craig Fisher. And in fact, in late 1966, Godsil purchased one of the very first Chevy Camaro Z28s to be produced. This was actually the 14th Z28, and it was sent to Gorrie's Chevrolet in Toronto, Canada. Gorrie's Chevrolet produced a small number of high-end Chevy Camaros called Black Panther Camaros. They were finished in black with gold striping, and the Godsil race car was finished the same way. Anyway, Fisher drove this car in the very first Trans-Am race of the 1967 season, and he finished second to the Dodge Dart of Bob Tullius. And thus, he became the first driver to score Trans-Am points for the Camaro. Round 7 of the Trans-Am stipulated 2 drivers per car, and Fisher teamed up with Mark Donohue in the Penske Racing Camaro. I assume that Terry Godsil played a role in making this happen. Anyway, Donohue and Fisher won the race, and this was also the very first Trans-Am victory for the Camaro. And so Fisher became the first driver to score Trans-Am points for the Camaro, and the first driver to score a Trans-Am victory for the Camaro. He also drove for Penske Racing in the final round at Kent, and then in the first 2 races of the 68 season at Daytona and Sebring. He and Donohue actually finished 3rd outright at Sebring against all the sports prototypes. And obviously this was an incredible result. And the car they shared was the famous Penske Racing lightweight Camaro, which had been built in late 1967. And it would seem that Terry Godsil had some involvement here too. If you look closely at this car, you will see Godsil's name right alongside Roger Penske's on the front fenders. Anyway, Penske Racing built 2 brand new Camaros for the 1968 Trans-Am, and when the second of these arrived for round 3 of the series, the 1967 lightweight was offloaded, and it went to Terry Godsil. It was repainted white with a black hood and a black centre stripe, and it was driven by, guess who? That's right, Craig Fisher. Fisher drove it from round 4 onwards, but when it appeared at round 7 at Meadowdale, it had been converted into a Pontiac Firebird. This is actually easier than you might think, because all the front panels can be unbolted. They added faux vents to the rear quarter panels, and I believe they also fitted the car with a Pontiac 10-volt rear end. But here's the thing, the Firebird still had a Chevy Z28 motor. Now, Godsil had somehow convinced the SCCA that in Canada you could order a Pontiac Firebird fitted with a Camaro Z28 motor. Now, I don't know if they actually bought that story, but regardless, they let the Firebird run with a Chevy motor. I figure they just thought it might be a good way to entice Pontiac into the Trans-Am series, and they were right. And because this was an independent team and not a factory team, maybe they also figured it wouldn't be a threat. Anyway, Fisher finished 4th on debut and thus became the first driver to score Trans-Am points for Pontiac. He also went on to finish 2nd at Continental Divide and 3rd at Riverside. And come the Briar round, the Firebird had been repainted yellow with black scallops. And then in the final race at Kent, the Pontiac team had expanded to 2 cars. And driving the second car was none other than Jerry Titus. Now, Titus had been instrumental in the success of Shelby American over the last few years, much as Ken Miles had done before him and Dave McDonald before him. Now, Carroll Shelby had a knack for finding guys who were great drivers, but also talented engineers who could literally build a race car from scratch. Now, Titus had won a bunch of Trans Am races for Shelby in 1967, but in 1968 the pickings were slim. Ford had inflicted the new tunnel port 302 onto the Shelby crew, trying to bridge the horsepower gap to Chevrolet, but it proved woefully unreliable. By late season, the whole mess was beginning to wear thin with Titus, and he started looking at other options. He'd seen Craig Fisher notching up podium positions in the Godsil Firebird, and could obviously see that there was potential for a Pontiac factory deal. But Shelby got wind of Titus's plans, and the pair parted company after the penultimate round of the series at Riverside. Anyway, Titus arrived for the final round in a hastily prepared Firebird and only went and stuck the thing on pole. And guess what? The Titus Firebird was also a converted Camaro. It had originally been built and raced by a guy called John Ward. And Titus was fast out of the box. The 68 Trans-Am series was being completely dominated by Mark Donohue in the Penske Racing Camaro, but Titus had the measure of him both in qualifying and the race. He led the first half, chased hard by Donohue, but his motor blew at the halfway point. And although Donohue went on to win the race, Fisher notched up another second place finish. Anyway, Godsil had done what he needed to get Pontiac on the hook. He and Titus teamed up to form TG Racing and became the Pontiac factory team for the 1969 Trans Am. And Pontiac, for their part, created a special homologation version of the Firebird. And they did a deal with the SCCA to use the name Trans Am, which was pretty ballsy. And in return, they paid the SCCA $5 for every Trans Am built. And while all this was taking place, Titus teamed up with John Ward to run the 1969 Daytona 24 Hours. They ran the same car that Titus drove in the Kent final in 1968, but it had now been repainted red and white. Daytona was no longer a part of the Trans Am series, but that didn't matter. Titus and Ward won their class and finished third outright, and were beaten only by a pair of Lola T70 Sports prototypes. So there was plenty of momentum going into the 1969 Trans Am season. And Pontiac played their part with the Trans Am street car, which was created specifically to homologate parts for the race cars. Specifically, this was a Firebird option called the Trans Am Performance and Appearance Package, and it cost $1,083 over the base Firebird. And in typical Pontiac fashion, it was way more outlandish than the Camaro Z28. It sported a special hood with a couple of massive snorkels that opened at its most forward end. And there were a couple of faux vents on the front fenders, which I assume could be made functional on the race cars to allow hot air to escape the engine bay and to reduce front end lift. And there was also a fully functioning wing attached to the rear deck lid. Now, Pontiac pumped in less money than the other manufacturers, so TG Racing topped up the coffers by producing additional cars to sell and lease. All in, they'd build around 6 cars for the 1969 season, and early indications were that these were going to be pretty epic. And in addition, they had some really good people involved, including Jerry Schwartz and Herb Adams. Adams was probably best known for creating the ram air system as seen on the Pontiac GTO and the Firebird. But he was also a really good suspension and chassis guy. Now, these cars had one of the best chassis of all the factory Trans Am teams and included a chromoly roll cage that extended to pick up the front subframe. The front body clip was designed so it could be easily removed as a single piece to help speed up repair times. And of course, the body and other components were acid dipped. And then there was the motor. Ace engine builder Al Bartz produced a special 303 cube version of the Pontiac, fitted with tunnel port heads and known as the Ram Air 5. Quite how this motor was going to be made legal for the Trans Am, I'm not sure. The SCCA said you couldn't reduce the size of the street motor to meet the 5-litre limit. The motor was based on the 400 cubic inch unit, into which Bartz fitted a 2.83 inch crank to make 303 cubes. And in order to homologate it, 1,000 of these units had to be built. Was Pontiac planning to do this? I'm actually not sure. But in the end, it really didn't matter because the Ram Air 5 was actually a bit of a disaster. In testing, the main bearings kept being starved of oil because of their surface speed. And remember, dry sump systems were not allowed in the Trans-Am in 1969. Bart's likely could have resolved the issues with time, but time was fast running out. In the end, a request was put to the SCCA to run Chevy motors again. And this was approved, but the SCCA made them retrofit the cars with 1968 front sheet metal and the small rear spoilers. And they look kinda ridiculous, but the SCCA made the rules. And because TG Racing were preparing so many cars, this put them on the back foot from the off, and they never really caught up. Anyway, TG Racing ran 2 factory cars in the 1969 Trans-Am, but for some reason Craig Fisher was now out of the picture. Instead, Milt Minter drove the second car, at least initially. And at most races there were at least 2 customer cars. Oh, and Dick Brown drove the Fisher Firebird from 1968, that being the old Penske lightweight Camaro. The best Firebird result in the 1969 Trans-Am was a second place finish for Titus at Sargevite. And he placed third another 3 or 4 times. But the factory Firebirds never really had the pace of the Penske Camaros or the Bud Moore Mustangs. But they were more competitive than the factory Javelins and often faster than the Shelby Mustangs. So the little TG Racing team actually did pretty good considering the budget that they were working with and the crazy workload that they'd set themselves. And Pontiac was obviously pretty happy too because they extended the deal into 1970 and produced a new Trans-Am based on the second generation Firebird. And in part 2 we will cover the 1970 Trans-Am and 1971 and 72. But anyway, that's it for this episode folks. Hope you enjoyed this little video. If you did, please hit the like button and the subscribe button and tap that little bell thingy so you get a notification when I post up a new vid. Anyway, until next time, we will see you then. Cheers, bye.